Welcome back to RotoQL University. We're doing our NFL strategy course on running backs. This time we'll be talking about running back selection for tournaments. This is Mike, and I've got Sahil here as well.
How you doing, guys? Ready to talk about some winning tournament running backs?
Yep, really interested in what you got to say here. Let's get into the overview.
So here we can take a look at what the average salary for a running back is and what their fantasy points. So we'll see that running back salaries are generally a lot lower on DraftKings than quarterbacks, and about the same as wide receivers. We'll see that the dollar per point of running backs is a little bit higher than they are for wide receivers and even tight ends. So that means that generally a random running back is not going to be as good a play as a random wide receiver. Obviously, this is subject to change for the DraftKings pricing algorithm, but my expectation is that this will not change too much going forward. And I think the reason you will see this is because points per reception is such a valuable thing, and wide receivers obviously catch more balls than running backs. So one thing we'll want to look at is the correlation between fantasy points and other stats. So pretty clearly the number of yards per game for a team is going to be very highly correlated to running back fantasy points. Obviously, if a player is getting a lot of yards, he's going to put up a lot of fantasy points. The other thing is snaps per game. Players that get continuous opportunities are going to put up a lot of fantasy points. And the thing here is that the correlation between touches per game and snaps per game is pretty close. But snaps per game is something that's going to be a little more consistent than the individual touches in the game. So something that I'd look at is number of snaps per game over touches per game, because you'll have more consistency with the snaps. Another thing that's very important is receiving yards, especially when we're going to be talking about tournament strategy now. Receiving guards are going to give you extra points than you normally would expect, and for monster performances, almost always running backs are going to have to put up a lot of receiving yards if you want to get a 25 or 30-point game. Another big factor for running backs is looking at favorites and underdogs, and this is something that we talked about in the cash game strategy. We'll see that rushing yards for favorites are about 13 more or 12.5 more for favorites, and there's actually an extra quarter of a touchdown for favorites, which is a more important one. Looking at the number of 1+ rushing TD games, that percentage is also significantly higher. And since we're going to need touchdowns for running backs to put up a big score, which you'll need in a tournament, we want to target favorites for the most part. Another thing we'll look at is home versus away. And we'll see that TDs and yards per game are also higher there. But we can attribute most of that to home teams generally being the favorite. This is something that we talked about before in the other decks, is the coefficient of variation is going to be higher for quarterbacks, higher for running backs and quarterbacks, but lower than wide receivers. And we know this because running backs get touch the ball second most on the team generally after the quarterback. So running backs will be more consistent and may not have as much of an elite upside as maybe wide receivers or tight ends. if we look at the number of rushing attempts by field position, we can clearly tell that in the red zone and within each team's 1 through 10 yard and the opposition's 1 to 10 yard, you're going to get the most rushing plays, and obviously plays that start in your opposition's 1 yard line to 10 yard line are going to result in the most touchdowns. So we really want to target players that get touches in those parts of the field. When we look at running backs in tournament lineups, we really want to look at the run and pass ratios, who is getting what opportunities and how many opportunities are they going to get, some of the highest scoring teams, whether or not you should stack with your running back, some things that go into ownership, and whether there's some additional things you can look at to help give you an edge. So this shouldn't be too surprising to anybody, but when a team is trailing, they're going to obviously pass the ball significantly more and only run it around 1/3 of the time. When the game is tied, you're going to see that decrease slightly, and when a team is leading, you're going to see a more balanced play call distribution. And what this means is that you really want to target players who are going to be leading for most of the game, which is big favorites. If we look at some of the highest scoring games in 2013, we can see that while we have some running backs that are very, very elite, putting up 60 plus points in one occasion, we'll see that running backs generally aren't going to have as high upside as wide receivers. And that's primarily because running backs don't catch the ball as often. And when you get into a game where a team is behind in the last 10 minutes and they're passing like crazy, those are the situations that are going to really, really rack up huge fantasy scores. And we won't see that with running backs as much. So you maybe not want to target as expensive running backs as you would wide receivers, especially in your tournament lineups. So we'll see that teams that stack a running back and the defense can do quite well, and running back and wide receiver is also something that's a little bit common. I would definitely prefer that you stack a running back and a defense together, mostly because if a team's defense is doing really well, team is likely leading, and then the running back will put up a lot of fantasy points. So you'll see a definite correlation between running backs and defenses, something that you won't see as strongly between a running back and a wide receiver, since if one gets yards, the other cannot. While running back and wide receiver has been effective, it's something that I tend to shy away from. On FanDuel, we'll see similar things: running back defense, running back wide receiver. We'll see lower stack between a running back and a defense here, and a little bit lower on running back and a wide receiver. Again, I would recommend doing a running back and a defense, or even doing a running back alone, rather than doing a running back and a wide receiver together. So let's take a look at a sample week from 2014, and we can kind of look at the distribution of ownership. That should be somewhat typical, although each week is different. We'll see that there is one running back, Rashad Jennings, in this example, who is very, very highly owned. And then you'll see a couple higher ownerships on the upper end, upper tier. This is because FanDuel, with no PPR, running backs are generally more valuable and touchdowns are worth a lot. And the higher priced running backs are the running backs that generally will play 3 downs and will get the goal line opportunities. So they'll offer a little bit more consistency, especially on FanDuel. If you looked at this for DraftKings, you'd see a much wider disparity and less ownership in the high price running backs. So again, we're going to hammer home the point that running backs that are favorites are going to put up more fantasy points than running backs that are wide receivers. Especially in double-digit spreads, we'll see a bigger disparity here because a team who is a big favorite are obviously going to be running the ball a lot if the game goes according to plan. Let's take a look at an example from last year in an NFL tournament. We'll see that I targeted David Johnson, a player who was getting all the goal line carries and catching a lot of balls. So he will be an elite tournament option, mostly because he catches a bunch of balls. And then we'll see with Thomas Rawls. He was lower owned. He had a lower price because he was filling in for Marshawn Lynch, who was out for a while for the year. And you'll see that, as we've talked about in the cash games, backup running backs tend to make very good plays because they'll have a lower price point, but they'll probably get similar amount of touches as a starting running back would. So again, we'll see that 3 receptions with 22 yards, that extra 5 points can be very, very key in tournaments that you wouldn't get from a player like an Adrian Peterson, who may generally will put up more rushing yards but won't catch as many balls as some of the other great running back options. So we have plenty of resources on RotoQL to help you get better at DFS. You can visit our Zendesk to learn how to use RotoQL better to help you become a better player. You can go to the RotoQL Wire to get plenty of strategy and advice. Take advantage of that for sure. And then check out our other videos on RotoQL University. We'll be covering pretty much everything about NFL DFS for this upcoming season.